Marangaria, Nadu, Injamar, Wurundjeri, Main, Wurundjeri, Nurembang. In my language, Wiradjuri, I want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we are coming to you tonight. Well, how young is too young to be on social media? And we'll ask a government minister tonight why she took campaign contributions from Sportsbet. Joining our panel, tennis champion and broadcaster Jelena Dokic, who's faced intense scrutiny online. Communications Minister and member for Greenway, Michelle Rowland. Shadow Communications Minister and member for Banks, David Coleman. Youth Advocate for Planned International Australia, Imogen Senior. And presenter, 10 News First, Midday and Studio 10, Narelda Jacobs. Can the government protect us from trolls?
Thank you very much for that welcome. I'm Stan Grant. It's great to be with you. Now, remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag. A bit later, we're going to be discussing online scams. Been online scammed? Yeah? Yeah, I'll join that. And social media as well, which is the topic of our online poll tonight. We're going to ask, is 13 too young to be active on social media? So if you're 13 or over, cast your votes on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. We'll bring you the results a bit later. To get us started tonight, here's Thomas Condell.
Lots of proposed changes have been announced by our Treasurer today to our superannuation scheme. If it is now harder for people to dip into their super, especially young people trying to get into our current housing market, which is significantly more difficult than it was for me 30 years ago, how do you think our younger generation of Australians are going to cope during these tougher times with so much more rigidity of rules?
Michelle,
whose money is it? Theirs or ours?
Good question. Whose money is it? Theirs or ours? Michelle Rowland?
Thank you for the question. And firstly, I acknowledge that there are many people doing it tough at the moment under cost of living. As it stands under interest rates, I myself represent an area of Western Sydney that traditionally is under high levels of mortgage stress. So I can certainly empathise with the content of your question. I think to go back to what the Treasurer has announced today is an objective for superannuation. There are three pillars in our retirement income scheme. There's pensions, there's savings, and then there's superannuation. Having a definition of superannuation, an objective, is really central to how this multi-trillion-dollar asset is governed. And it's actually long been an objective of other governments to define this as well, because it gives certainty to that sector, but also because it sets the tone for other changes that may come in this area. And I know that even under Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, there are attempts to do that. But what we have announced today is a consultation on the objective of superannuation. Labor, of course, instigated superannuation under the Hawke-Keating government, and it's important to us that people have a dignified retirement. None of this, of course, detracts from the key theme that I believe you are asking. People are doing it tough today. Why can't they dip into their super? We did see during the last couple of years some $30 billion or so of superannuation taken out of that system. And I think by examining and by consulting on what the objective is of superannuation and understanding that as a population we are getting older, there are going to be additional pressures on our social services system, for example, and on many other aspects of society. I still think it is really important, and successive governments have recognised the importance of having a stable superannuation regime. Of course, cost of living pressures still remain, but I think the key point here is understanding that the objective of superannuation is about retirement incomes. So, of course, not detracting from anything you've said and acknowledging that, I think we need to be mindful about what the purpose of superannuation is, and I'll end on this point. Too many people have retired and died poor in this country without superannuation. It has made a fundamental difference to the quality of people's lives, but also to our economy, having that amount of funds under management, and increasingly governments looking to see what they can do with different vehicles for investing that superannuation. So it's important for long-term productivity, but it's also important, as successive intergenerational reports have shown, that we have the best opportunity for people to have a dignified retirement and not die poor.
David Coleman, I'll get you to come in on this. COVID was, of course, exceptional circumstances and people dipped in then, but they're going to pay a price later on, aren't they, for what they took out? And if you're going to be able to maintain retirement, don't we even have to go further and look at tightening some of the restrictions and also having to put increased taxes on superannuation if we're going to be able to pay for it?
Well, I think that the crux of the question here was whose money is it? And it's your money. It's not the government's, it's not mine, it's not the minister's, it's certainly not Jim Chalmers' money, it's your money. And all of the research shows that in retirement, the single biggest indicator of whether someone is comfortable in retirement or indeed faces poverty in retirement is home ownership. And so we think that to use some of your super in a modest, controlled fashion towards getting a deposit on your first home makes an enormous amount of sense. Because ultimately, if you're able to get into the housing market earlier, much earlier than you otherwise would have been, because you're able to access your super, you are set up, frankly, so much better than you are if you don't. And this is an interesting question because it's kind of a philosophical one about how we think about government and how we think about people's own assets. We think that people should have the greatest control possible over their own futures and their own assets. And yes, superannuation is about retirement, but that doesn't mean it has to all be locked up in a particular asset class. Get this, Dan. You can right now put your superannuation money in to buy commercial property or a rental property that you rent out to someone else, but you can't use it to actually towards buying your own property.
This is if you're having a self-managed super fund and you wanted to go and invest in that. And I'll go back to you, Michelle Rowland, just on this, to go back to the question of whose money is it. There are exceptions, aren't there, where people can get access to it if there is hardship or compassionate grounds. Are you going to be looking at tightening that as well? And what about the options that David Coleman raised in terms of being able to invest where you want to invest or use it to get into the market to buy a home you can live in?
Well, I think a couple of points there. Firstly, of course, there are, and have always been in the scheme, exceptional, compassionate circumstances, often to the point where they're life-threatening, where funds have been able to be released. But I respectfully think what David is describing is a false economy. Dipping into your retirement incomes for a set point in time and then leaving that deficit later on, that is not the intention of superannuation. But I think it is important.
If the home increases in value, as we know, particularly in the red-hot markets, sometimes like Sydney or Melbourne, you can reap a significant return, can't you?
Well, Stan, let's be realistic. House prices go up and down in values as well. And the important point here is that this is intended to be for retirement, for a dignified retirement. But certainly it is individuals' money. There is choice of super. There are a number of reforms that have come in place over the years that enables greater decisions to be made by those holders of super funds. And I think, again, the question comes down to, well, how are we going to, what sort of pillar in the retirement incomes policy are we going to deal with here? Like, are we going to increase savings? Are we going to increase pensions? Superannuation is the area where people, there are some billions of funds under management at the moment. We expect them to do more. But this, I want to end on this point, this is about consulting on the objective. It's important for this sector to have stability, and it's important when we go forward and think about how we can leverage
I want to bring
this.
Jelena Dokic into this.
Yeah, look, I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit naive when it comes to these things, but does it have to be black and white? Does it have to be one or the other? I feel like we saw this in COVID, didn't we, where people were really struggling. there's a lot of different areas where I think you should be maybe able to access it. I think there is so much that we're seeing today when it comes to domestic violence, for example, and women are so afraid to leave. And one of the reasons is because they feel like they won't be able to start again. They won't be able to set them up. I was in that position when I was 19. I was just lucky with the fact that I was a professional athlete. I was already on a tour. I had the ability to actually from there go and earn a living, but I left home with nothing. I was basically on the street. There are so many women out there that are in the same position. So maybe making it where you can actually maybe withdraw. Maybe it's a, I don't know, $10,000 so that you can have these situations where you can actually put your money to use when you really need it. Because there are so many people that are not even going to get to retirement and be able to, like you said, have a dignified retirement because they're not going to make it. They might not even be here. So I think maybe it has to be a bit of a balance.
Stan, can I just...
Just quickly, David, I want to bring Imogen and Narelda. Just quickly, I want to make...
I just wanted to pick up, Michelle used the term dignified retirement, and one of the best ways to build towards having a dignified retirement is to own a home. And we think that people should be able to access super in a modest, controlled way to help them do that. And we don't think, to be frank, it's the role of government to tell them they're not allowed to.
Narelda, for First Nations people as well, when you have a life expectancy that's 10 years less than the general population amongst our communities, many people won't live to see super. Should we be looking at reform around when people can access it and what the cultural and socioeconomic impact of that is?
That's a really good point. And another good point also, Stan, is that we're assuming that people have super. I mean, there are a lot of people in the casual workforce that don't have a lot of super. A lot of those people are female workers that don't have a lot of super to even access to be able to put the money into a accommodation, into a house that, even if you access your super to pay a deposit in the house, with the way that the market's going, is the house going to be worth less than the mortgage that you've got to pay for it? So have you, in effect, wasted that investment in your own future because you can't afford to have a house and that's the only way? So I think the whole entire system needs to reform, and life expectancy is a really good point, Stan. The whole YOLO, you only live once. I mean, should you pay for it now, live in the moment and provide for the now and kind of leap and hope the net will appear in the future?
That's an interesting point to go to Imogen on too, because how do younger people see this? Because, when I speak to some younger people, they say that perhaps they won't even see their super. They don't really trust in the system yet.
Yeah, I think, personally, I have about $500 in my super, which is pretty scary.
You've got a long time to earn.
I know, I do, yeah. I think my main argument here is that super doesn't exist to subsidise basic human rights. I see young people taking super out to access medical care. In a country that claims to have universal health care, we see people using it to access dental care that is vital. We're seeing it, people accessing it in order to access housing, a basic human right that really we should have other mechanisms to make sure that people are being looked after. Sorry, I've still got a few more things to say. We do know that as well, super is disproportionately low for women, and that's one of the reasons why elderly women and older women are one of the fastest growing groups for homelessness. And in that way, and as we've heard, especially for people who've been involved in, who've been victim to interpersonal violence, the hands of a former partner, home ownership is not going to help them escape and support themselves. And we know as well that young people, if we're taking our super out earlier, that has a disproportionate impact on our finances.
Thank you. We do have a lot to get through tonight. We'll go to our second question now from Rhonda Gerard.
Thank you. Can a minister take money from a lobby group, say the gambling sector, and still be trusted to make decisions in the interests of the community?
I think she means you, Michelle Rowland.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the question. And up front, I want to acknowledge that transparency and accountability is important to Australians. And Australians always expect better when it comes to this area, even when no rules have been broken. And I respect that, and I think that that is a reasonable position to hold.
So do you now say it was wrong to take the money from Sportsbet, $19,000 in donations from Sportsbet?
What I'm saying is, whilst this was compliant with all the rules, I appreciate that there need to be different levels of accountability and that there's different and community views on this matter. But also, I think this highlights one very important aspect, and that is about disclosure of political donations. I think that this is an area of long overdue reform, and the Albanese government has had a long-held position, for example, of decreasing the disclosure threshold, so it is a lower amount that needs to be disclosed, but also having real-time reporting. And if this conversation encourages that to be sped up and we get results in that, then I think that is a good thing, and I'll be participating in that discussion.
If you feel that way now, why didn't you feel that way then when you were taking the 19,000 from Sportsbet?
Well, my answer stands. And what I would also point out, because you go to a very important question about how a minister's judged. Ministers and governments are judged on delivery. And myself in opposition and now in government, and the government itself once in opposition, has a very strong track record when it comes to the fundamental issue of where governments regulate in this area, and that's on harm minimisation. I would point out that the most fundamental change to the regulatory system, one that has been talked about since 2015, which is a national self-exclusion register, so people who are vulnerable with one touch can actually exclude themselves, will be proclaimed under me as Minister. We are pushing ahead with this.
I understand you didn't declare the donations that was exposed through Sportsbet's financial records, and so we don't know from the time that you were elected till now what decisions you've made based on that donation. So when you're talking about disclosure, you didn't disclose this, and we don't know what decisions you have made that have been influenced by that. So, you know, the issue of trust in who you are actually representing. Are you representing Sportsbet or are you representing the community?
I respect the question and all aspects of it, and I'll answer them in turn. The first is that governments, as I said, are judged on their record. The disclosure rules, as they exist at any point in time, have always been complied with by myself, including disclosures to the Parliament and the Ministerial Code of Conduct. But you make an excellent point in terms of how are we to judge that. And I ask that you judge that on the evidence. The evidence is that we have had a strong track record on harm minimisation, supporting the establishment of a national consumer protection framework. Next month, new advertising taglines come into place. I will be the minister responsible for turning on the first self-exclusion register that will apply nationally and apply to all of those platforms. But there's three other very important points that we have in the pipeline, and they've been talked about for a long time but not acted on. The first is in terms of credit card betting, which we are looking at very closely and which I will lead as Minister for reform in this area, not only because the evidence is there, but we will ensure that harm minimisation always remains paramount. The second is a long overdue response to the review of classification. Currently, there are games that have loot boxes or simulated like gambling that are not regulated. And clearly, this is an area of concern for many parents and vulnerable children.
Can I just come in and just get a very quick answer to this question? I want to just go back to Rhonda very quickly and then go to the other panel. From now on, will you not accept money from gambling companies?
I will not take money from Sportsbet, and I look forward
from any
to the outcomes.
gambling companies?
I haven't taken, as I said...
In the future?
As I said, I'm now the Minister. I will not be taking money from Sportsbet.
Can I ask, will you meet with the Gambling Reform Alliance? I understand that you've refused to meet with Peter Scott Costello.
I have met with the Gambling Reform Alliance, and we had a very productive discussion about where they can fit into the regulatory regime and reform in this area.
Rhonda, thanks for your question. I understand you're a Greens councillor as well from Dandenong, and this issue is very close to you.
Yeah, in my community, $150 million comes out of our community every year. We're the poorest LGA in the state. That money is coming off the table of literally off the children in our area.
David Coleman, the coalition as well took money from Sportsbet, over $100,000 at the last election as well. So if you're talking about a situation here, it could equally be yourself sitting where Michelle Rowland is, isn't it? If your parties are taking money from gambling companies.
Well, the key, the key issue, Stan, is that everyone's got to comply with the rules, and there are very detailed rules around disclosure around funding for the political parties and ministerial disclosures, as the Minister mentioned.
That's not what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about here potentially being compromised by big gambling that are putting money into political companies. Are you prepared to say right now, as Michelle Rowland said tonight, that you wouldn't be taking any future funds from gambling companies?
Well, look, Stan, I mean, we follow the rules. There's a review, actually, of the donation rules happening right now under the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters.
So you'd be happy taking money from Sportsbet?
Well, Stan, I think what we should do is allow that committee to do its reviews, and it'll come back and make recommendations. And the government, just to be clear, Stan, the government hasn't changed the laws. The Minister's made a statement just here, but the laws are exactly the same today as they were yesterday. So the Minister's basically saying that something that wasn't okay a few weeks ago for her that was okay a few weeks ago is not okay today. I think the better way and the orderly way to do it is to say, let's look at the rules overall, which is what the committee is doing. It's then a matter for the government to say, what does the government think the law of Australia should be? And then the opposition will have a view. And I think that's the way.
I want to go to Jelena Dokic. As someone who works in sports commentary, you've worked in sport as well. Are you concerned about the increasing influence of sports gambling online companies, particularly the advertising of sports gambling as well?
Look, it's been something that we've talked about in tennis as well now for a couple of years, and especially in the last few years, there's been a lot. And I think for me, those companies perhaps working with the governing bodies to help with players and with sports people as well, because there's been a lot. Players have, thrown matches and a lot has happened, and we've had actually quite a few players where they've gotten life bans, where they can't ever be in tennis again, not even work in tennis, and we've had that happen quite a bit over the last 5 years, and the governing bodies in tennis have done a lot to help players as well, because it's gotten to a point where, there's been life threats if you don't do certain things and if you don't, perform the way that they want you to, and it got really messy and it got really dangerous. So I think it's more about, I'm looking at it from a sports person's perspective, and I was in the sport for a very long time, and while a lot of that was going on, I think it's about the safety at the end of the day of sports people and athletes, and how can maybe those companies actually work with athletes, with the governing bodies in certain countries, but also our worldwide governing bodies, the WTA and the ATP, to actually prevent a lot of this happening.
Let's go to our next question now from Erin Constable.
Should your name and identity be connected to your social media profiles to stop anonymous trolling? For example, like connecting your birth certificate to your Instagram.
Imogen.
Thank you so much for your question. I think I'm a young person who exists on social media and sees the harm that trolling can cause and the pain that can bring, especially when we don't even know who's perpetrating it against us. I think I have two main points about linking our identities to our social media accounts. Firstly, there isn't actually enough evidence that will help. That we don't currently have enough evidence that anonymity is a driving force for a lot of hate speech and misogyny that occurs online. And personally, I think when we're looking at the sheer scale of violence against women that we have in this country, and the sheer scale of violence against queer people and racialised abuse we experience, anonymity is not always required for people to perpetrate that type of harm. We see it in street harassment. We see it in sexual assault against women. We see it in interpersonal violence, that actually anonymity is not needed in order to be causing direct harm against women. And so there isn't currently enough evidence that linking people's identity would prevent this type of abuse. And secondly, we need to be really careful as well, especially when we're talking about queer people online. There are many people who might want to be out in online spaces but wouldn't want to be out in their real lives per se, and it wouldn't be safe for them to be out. And the same problem exists for sex workers. The same problem exists for a lot of mutual aid organisations. And so, yeah, my response there is twofold.
Narelda, would it help if you could identify the person, particularly people who are perpetrating hate speech, violence online?
I'd like to. I mean, I think we all probably get trolled on our socials. For me, it's the times that I've spoken out about certain things that people, don't agree with, but things that need to be said, to remind people that not everyone is grieving the Queen, to be amongst the first to advocate for changing the date or abolishing the date, and to have a rethink of our national identity. You know, those types of things
What
are very
happens
unpopular.
in those cases?
Well, people say some really vicious things, and they, you know, when you look at their profiles, they have, you know, 0 followers. There's never a photo. You don't know whether it's a real person or not. Or whether they have multiple accounts. And sometimes when you go back to find that comment, it's deleted because their account is deleted, and so they just set up another one. Yeah, so, I mean, I think we all know what it feels like to be trolled. I mean, a lot of people say that LinkedIn is kind of the friendly social media because everyone's careers are linked to that platform. So it's harder to be anonymous because usually it's kind of it's a professional sort of a platform. But
Is any worse than any other in your case?
well, Twitter. Twitter is terrible. I rarely go on Twitter, and I'm very upset when people, you know, journalists that I respect, you know, female presenters that I respect, leave Twitter because the trolling has got so bad and because of no reason, because of nothing that they've said, just that they're there. It's really upsetting because we need those people. They're part of our national conversation. You know, we need them. So to think that they've been driven off a platform because the trolling has got so bad that they're, you know, that they're constantly told, you know, that they shouldn't exist and all these awful things.
Hold that thought if you wouldn't mind, Jelena, because we're going to stay on this topic with Donna Davies.
Jelena, how did you first become aware of the online trolling that you were experiencing, and what impact did it have on you both personally and professionally, and what more do you think could be done?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's such an important one and something that I've now been kind of fighting publicly for the last 2 or 3 years. And it's not an easy topic to talk about because I think ultimately what we're trying to do is just go out there, go about our day, you know, do our job. We are, you know, in the public eye and being public figures, but that shouldn't stop us from, you know, having an Instagram account and having it open. And at the end of the day, you know, I'm not out here hurting anyone. I'm just actually, in fact, the opposite. I'm trying to do something good with my platform and create a safe space and a community as well. And then, you know, you do get a bit of this hate and you get trolling, and I've had it from everything from, you know, mental health perspective to body shaming, you know, to abuse as well. And I consider myself to be pretty strong, I think, and I've got pretty thick skin, but to actually read some of those things to, you know, when it comes to, you know, are you going to try and kill yourself again with a laughing emoji, which is what happened this year. And I'm not the only one that gets put through this. So yeah, it's been something that I'm actually so passionate about. And I've had people close to me that actually really care about me go, you know, don't read that stuff. Or, you know, some people have said, oh, well, you know, you put yourself out there on the social media, that's to be expected. It's not, actually. Why is it normal to be abused? Right? If we had it in real life, people wouldn't be able to get away with it. If I was on a tennis court, on centre court, in the middle of the Australian Open, and someone was, you know, screaming out and insulting me, they would get taken away, right, by security, and there would be consequences. So I think the question is, why are there no consequences when it actually comes to social media? And just one more thing, they have no idea actually how much damage they are doing. During this summer, I've actually called it evil, and I really stand behind that. And and why I say that is because actually people's lives are at stake. You have no idea how many people I had just walking through the grounds of the Australian Open, going to, you know, my next match to commentate and do my work, come to me and say, or even write to me actually on social media and say, you know, thank you so much for actually tackling this because, you know, my brother took his life 24 hours ago and we were at his funeral. And then you read these comments and it was breaking my heart to actually hear this. But I actually know that that's how it works because there's so many people suffering. Nine Australians, just in Australia alone, every single day take their life. That's almost 3,500 people a year and almost 1 million people worldwide, and then someone is out there actually joking about it, you don't know what kind of a damage it can do to me or to someone else. They might take their life because of that. There needs to be more accountability, responsibility. Maybe, you know, it's not going to help to have a verified account where you have to give your details, your driver's license, and actually prove who you are to actually open an account. But I certainly think it's something to try, because the accounts that I've gotten abused from, 90% of them were private accounts, no picture, like you said, no followers, anonymous. But also, as soon as I called them out this year, and I didn't even put their accounts up, I thought I'd be, you know, take the higher ground here, be the nice person, even though people wanted me to. They actually went and they deleted it straight away. They went and deleted all of those comments because you called them out. By being silent, they actually have the control. So I feel like it's really important to really fight.
Well done. It does. Thank you, Jelena. I'll bring in the two politicians here as well, because are we talking about a need for greater regulation here? Does it go as far as the previous questioner put, and that is actually forcing people to be identified? What can you do, Michelle Rowland?
Well, firstly, Jelena said she's a fighter, but I think it's important to note that she shouldn't be left to fight alone. There is a role for civil society, for governments, for regulation in this area as well. And it's fortunate in Australia that we have a leading agency in the E-Safety Commissioner that actually does have powers under the Online Safety Act to listen to complaints, to take down posts, and even unmask people, go behind that anonymity where it's required to carry out the act.
By this stage, so much of the damage is done.
Yeah, it's done, but also I've done this, by the way. I'm not on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I've done this. I've reported it. I've even blocked some people. There is no action, by the way. I looked at it a week later. Those posts were not taken down, right? So nothing was actually done, right? I called them out, all of them got taken off. But my question in general is not to you, but just in general, why can someone write something that damaging? I'm not going to repeat those things again, or, you know, but there is no filter, that stays there. And let's think about this as well. What message are we sending to the younger generation that this is okay?
Well, certainly it's not okay. We do have a cyberbullying scheme for children and an adult cyber abuse scheme that takes thousands of cases and complaints and that are dealt with by investigators at eSafety. This is an aspect of the law. It's barely a year old, and we're bedding down as a government a lot of those implementation points in the Act. But I think one of the most important things I take away, Jelena, from what you're saying is that people need to report this. We have an E-Safety Commissioner. Unfortunately, not enough people know that it is there, that it has these resources and that it has these powers. And there's also interaction between the E-Safety Commissioner and the platforms. And platforms acting on their own are often not incentivised to act quickly. And that's why we have these regulations in place.
Look, I think the really fundamental point here is that the social media companies don't care a great deal about online safety. That's the reality. And as a consequence, in Australia, we've had to take some very strong regulatory action. So the Minister mentioned the E-Safety Commission that we set up in 2015. Cyberbullying regulations will be taken down for kids, cyber abuse for adults, which just came in the Online Safety Act a year or so ago. But the fundamental problem here is the social media companies show a thuggish disregard for the mental health of Australians. And so what that means is, as a government, you need to lean forward. And the social media companies are
You had a long time in government to lean forward.
And we did, Stan. And we did. I mean, the E-Safety Commissioner, there is nothing else in the world like the E-Safety Commissioner. And of course, and to Jelena's point, is every single awful thing that happens online removed? No, of course not. No one's suggesting that. We'd love to get to that point. But the E-Safety Commissioner has clearly been very valuable. But I think the really important point here, Stan, is that the social media companies are very sophisticated. They're very smart. They're very good at sort of moving the ball down and coming up with plausible sounding reasons as to why not much should happen. And that's why regulatory action is important. There's some other things that we should
We did
talk
ask some of those companies to appear tonight, but they're not here, perhaps another time. Can I just put a quick question to Narelda and Imogen as well? It's something that occurs to me, I hear it from other people as well. Why stay on it?
Because it's a beautiful place. It is actually a beautiful place. Instagram is a beautiful place. You still get some nasty messages on Instagram. And, you know, here I am on Valentine's Day with love in my heart, mostly for myself. And then there's someone who's tagged me in a comment, burn in hell, hell is waiting, you know. And so I felt really sad after reading that because, you know, it's Valentine's Day. But, you know, it's, for the most part, Instagram is a really beautiful place. It's an empowering place.
Twitter?
It's where I started out with social media and in a big way, sharing all of myself, giving so much of myself, like you do as well, Jelena. You've created a safe space for people to come and feel empowered and supported, and you find a community there.
Yeah, and I don't think when you go, well, why stay on it? You know, why should we succumb to people that are doing something that is so not okay, something that is not
And Imogen, it is a community, isn't it, too?
Yeah, and I think there are amazing things that social media is able to offer us. I think I find incredible resources around queer history and queer education that I wouldn't have access to otherwise. I think I have amazing communities of political opinions, of mutual aid that I'm able to access, and I think that's incredible. And asking women just to log off, which is one of the most popular comments I've seen when we're talking about this, on Twitter especially, is asking women to remove themselves from another aspect of public life.
Yeah, and especially, I think that comment mainly goes to also people in a public eye or that have a platform. It's like, well, you are in the media, you kind of have to expect that, but no, why?
No, you don't.
Why do you have to expect it if you are, you know, it doesn't just go for us, much more famous people than us and singers and athletes in the world. Why is that normal? Because you are in the public eye that it's normal to be abused. I actually really, tried to use
We're going to,
I actually really tried to use mine for something good. People come, and especially women, to maybe get a bit of motivation, help. I've gotten it from other people as well. So why can't we create this beautiful community and safe space, which is what a lot of us are trying to do, without actually being abused?
We are going to stay with this topic and broaden it out to look at other aspects of it as well. If tonight's discussion has raised any issues for you or anyone you know, of course you can contact Lifeline, Kids Helpline or 13 Yarn. You can see the numbers there on your screen. If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A. We're live with Jelena Dokic, Michelle Rowland, David Coleman, Imogen Senior and Narelda Jacobs. Now to a topic you sent us many questions about. Here's Stanley Webb.
So due to the internet and more importantly social media, children aren't necessarily growing up quicker, but they're learning things quicker. In the modern age, if a child wants to know what something is or know what a term means, the answer is only at their fingertips, only a few clicks away. Even I'm beginning to have thoughts like, I didn't know that when I was their age, and I'm 16. So how does the panel think that we can deal with the very real effect that social media and the internet as a whole is having on our children?
Imogen.
I think so much of this comes down to understanding that we can't regulate what age people are going to be on social media. Kids are going to access social media, and our primary goal should be helping them navigate those spaces and equipping kids with the tools they need to feel supported as they move through those spaces, to ask them what they're trying to get out of those spaces, and to equip them with as many tools as possible in order to confront any harm that might be happening to them. To the questions about growing up too early, I think a lot of that does come back to that form of really comprehensive education that includes teachers, it includes the students themselves at the table, and it includes parents, and having that open dialogue and support systems in place is how we make sure that kids are feeling supported as they move through online spaces, which I think they have the right to be doing.
Stanley, what Imogen raised, you've actually confronted in your own life, haven't you, with a young relative of yours. Just quickly tell us what happened in that case.
Yeah, so a family friend of mine who was about 7 came to me, and they'd heard from, I think it was a friend, a very sexually explicit term, and then they'd gone online and looked it up, and then they came to me, and since they were 7, they wanted everybody to know about it. So they came to me and talked about it, and they went to all their friends and talked about it, and I don't think that children at the age of 7, even children at the age of like 10 or 11 or 12 should be knowing that sort of inappropriate stuff.
Can I respond to that, Stan? So just to pick up your point, this is, when you think about it, the first generation in human history where young kids have had pretty much unfiltered access to all the information, good and bad, of the world. And there's a lot of great things that come from that. And, you know, my whole career before politics was in digital, so I'm very supportive of digital generally. But we've got to be honest about the fact that, you know, a 7-year-old's mind is not designed to deal with that infinite complexity. And so the regulation around the Safety Commissioner and so on has been very, very important in addressing that. But there's another thing that we did before the election, which was released a draft online privacy code. And one of the provisions in that code would require social media companies to act in the best interests of children. And that's sitting there, that's available for the government to take up. And that requirement to act in the best interest of children would, I think, have a very significant difference, because would make a significant difference, because there's a lot of things that kids see that are promoted by social media that are plainly not in their best interests, and I don't think social media companies should be able to, you know, wash their hands of that.
Well, I think there's two things here. Firstly, the issue of children's data and access to children's data is one that has really been ignored for the past decade, and it goes to a previous issue we're discussing about age verification. And children's data really is, when you think about it, it has pros and cons. Is this a honeypot for cybersecurity issues, for example? What kind of information do parents want these platforms knowing about their children? But only last week, the government released a discussion paper on the issue of privacy, an area that's been underdone for 10 years and has really ignored those issues of children's privacy. So we're consulting on that at the moment, and that's got some really serious questions about how children's privacy should be dealt with online, because data is the big aspect. The second aspect that I think you're going to as well, and again, this has been underdone for 10 years, is media literacy, or as is often called, instead of EQ, DQ. So actually having that digital understanding, the ability
we're talking about 7-year-olds.
Exactly, exactly. But some of these, some very reputable organisations such as the Alana and Madeline Foundation, you know, this is the kind of programs that are being taken into schools and should be supported, and we have under our last budget.
But just respond directly, because the Minister's just said that, you know, nothing's happened for the last 10 years, which is patently absurd. The clause in the online privacy code is basically to create a duty on social media companies to act in the best interests of children. Now, that is sitting there available for the government to act upon, and the government hasn't acted upon it. So it's absurd to suggest.
You had 10
we can have a political debate, or we can be worried about a 7-year-old and Stanley's question. So I want to go to Narelda and talk about, you've raised a child, you've lived through this experience as well. What do you say to a 7-year-old who hears explicit sexual terms, can Google those terms, comes out and talks about it? You can go on YouTube, you can find things. How is it, is the genie just out of the bottle?
Well, I think if we're concerned about young children understanding complexities of adult, you know, concepts, and yet we don't have a problem with locking up 10-year-olds for criminal behaviour.
And in terms, Imogen, of age, I know you went to this before, and you know you can't put an age limit on it, but when you hear stories about people accessing material, and we know the harm that can come online as well, is there too young? Or is there being able to educate people young, parental involvement? Can parents possibly even police this or be able to oversee this?
I think my attitude will always be one of consulting and talking with children about things that are going to come up. Children are going to be exposed in everyday life to concepts that are really difficult to understand, and the pain that comes with that is incredibly real. However, I think if our only mechanism of trying to protect children is shutting down their access to platforms, that's number one, it's not going to work. Children are going to find ways to access material, they're going to find ways to find definitions, and So it's not going to work. And secondly, I think we see that it doesn't equip them in the long term. And so I think being able to find toolkits and sitting down with young kids who only want to process the world that's going on around them. There isn't malicious intent in children as they seek and are curious about
curiosity.
yeah.
Frank Viteri is here. Frank? Hi. Oh, there you are. You're a principal. I think, are you the principal at Stanley's
I am.
school?
It's great.
You got all your kids here? How do you deal with this at a school level?
Yeah, I've been a principal for a number of years, and I think that there are outstanding e-safety programs available, and the E-Commissioner, for instance, and the London Madeline Foundation have been really insightful and age-appropriate right through from 5 years of age through to senior secondary. So, and I think Stanley can articulate, and we understand that they're aware of what cyberbullying is. The problem is that despite any endeavour, the problem still exists. And we see firsthand examples like you explained about students not coming to school, the impact on their friends, on their families. So we are confronted with a dilemma of focusing on educational programs but not being able to achieve the intended outcomes. I do think, however, and just joining some conversation together, if we're thinking about online social media platforms, I'd love to see some forward publicity from the E-Safety Commissioner or from governments really helping educate the community and users about online safety and the power of kids teaching kids.
Well, maybe the politicians can take that on board. Thank you, Frank. We can bring you the results of our online poll now. We asked you, is 13 too young to be active on social media? Here's how you voted. Yes, 67%, no, 26%, and unsure, 6%. We're going to hear next from Dale Robinson.
Hi, my question is just, is the current government, or indeed the opposition, doing anything to stop the growing influx of scam and spam text messages that we receive on a daily basis in regards to fake tolls and bills that don't exist that seem to be growing every day?
I asked this at the start. Hands up who's been scammed, attempted scammed, or there. Wow. I can put mine up. And it can take, and sometimes incredibly convincingly. Jelena, has this happened to you?
Oh, yeah.
How'd you deal with it?
Especially since COVID. There's been a lot.
It happened a lot since COVID.
Yeah, and I almost got actually dragged into it because it was actually from like companies that you actually think, oh, actually, do I have an outstanding bill or something like that? But yeah, to be honest, I don't open anything. I delete it, and if I do, I call in or go and check myself. I know it's very difficult.
It's so hard to order, isn't it? Because it looks so convincing.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the WhatsApp message that I got recently. Mum, I've lost my phone. And I mean, you can kind of have fun. Like, if you're wise to it, you can kind of have a bit of fun with them. And well, I mean, you know, knowing that you're going to catch them out. And so I was just like, oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. Where are you? I'll come and get you. You know, and
I just want to raise a point. Like, it's all about, we've talked about social media, and we'll go back into a little bit into the previous question. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things where it's just really hard to do anything, like as much as we try to. And this is the part of life today. When we grew up, we didn't have phones. We didn't have mobile phones. And, you know, we've gone so far forward, especially in the last 2 decades. This is now a normal part of life, especially when it comes to kids as well. Maybe I'm a little bit old-fashioned here, but I think when it comes to stuff like this, it's don't do it, don't open it. I think education needs to be out there, whether it's for kids, whether it's for schools, workplaces
Older
as
people
well.
are targeted
Older
too,
people
who
as
just
well.
don't even know.
But also when it comes to kids, like, I'm all for freedom, and but I think we have to go a little bit to what we used to do. I think kids don't know anything until we teach them, right? So why do you have a smartphone if you're 7?
Yeah.
You know, why do you have a tablet or access to it if you're 7 or 8 years old? And I think some of these things we have to go back to basics. It's books, it's education, and what you should be doing as a kid. And it comes to scam messages as well.
I'll just get a quick response, Michelle, from you, just to the direct question about what can be done to stop these scams.
Well, firstly, it is debilitating. There's some $2 billion, but that's only what's reported, because the damage is financial. It can also be in terms of identity being stolen, but it's emotional as well. The number of cases that we've seen where people are just too embarrassed to report it because they've been scammed. There's a couple of areas in which the government is approaching this, and some of it comes from the telco side. So, for example, requiring the telcos to have in place mechanisms to detect, trace and block scams. That's scam calls and scam texts. And there's been an enormous number, I think it's like 500 million scam calls that have been stopped since that came in. When you think about how many scam calls you get today, you can just think about the quantum of that as well. But also we're looking at new measures around the integrity of the numbering system, because these scammers are sophisticated, they're often bad actors located overseas, but in the end of the day, they are criminals. They manage to find ways to slip into legitimate text messages, for example. So we're looking, and we've tasked the regulator to come up with a few options in this as well. The integrity of the numbering system is really important. It's also international cooperation that needs to be done, but this is it's a multifaceted approach. You know, talking about the Hey Mum scam, this is one in which the federal police were involved in tracking that down and busting that as well. And I think Australians are rightly much more alive to this, especially considering the recent cyber breaches and reports of increased scams as a result of those cyber breaches. So it is a top priority for keeping Australians safe. We are establishing a national anti-scam centre as well, and there's a lot more that can be done on the technology front that we're exploring, and we'll have no hesitation in legislating and regulating to get results for consumers.
Dale, thank you for that question. Thank you. We're going to hear next from Mark Hoysted.
This is a question to David Coleman. Your party's leader infamously walked out of the Parliament during the apology to Indigenous peoples in 2008. And currently the Federal Liberal Party seems to be deliberately playing a dead hand when it comes to the the voice to Parliament. Now, it might seem like this is a clever strategy in the party room, David, but to the rest of us out here in the real world, we see it for what it is. It's just a lack of moral courage and a willingness to play political games at the expense of our nation. And the question I have for you is, when would you and your colleagues realise that there are some issues so important to our nation that doing nothing is never an option?
Look, thank you for your question, and obviously I completely reject the premise of the question. So here's the situation. So we have a proposal from the government for the voice. Now, what we've said as an opposition is we've got a whole series of questions about that, and we'd like them to be answered. And what the government's basically saying is they're not going to be answered. And frankly, the government's effectively saying you shouldn't be asking because we'll deal with that later. Now, that's one approach. That's the government's approach. I think it's completely wrong. And to be frank, I think it is disrespectful to the Australian community to be unwilling to engage in a sensible, mature and calm discussion about the details of the voice. Why should the opposition, or for that matter any Australian, not be allowed to ask questions about the voice? The Prime Minister said in Parliament the other day.
I don't think there's any shortage of questions.
Well,
Peter Dutton's had access to the advisory committees. He's had access to all of the reports. He's asking a lot of questions.
Well, and so he should, Stan, because it's not a trivial thing to change the Constitution. We've done it 8 times in 122 years. And Mr Dutton absolutely appropriately is asking questions about, well, how's it going to work? How's this body going to be elected and so on? And the Prime Minister in Parliament a few weeks ago said words to the effect of, have a heart, support the voice, words to that effect, I'm paraphrasing, which effectively implies that if one doesn't support the voice or is asking questions about the voice, that person doesn't have a heart. And that is absurd, because we all want the best for Indigenous Australians. We all acknowledge that there's been things in our history that have been terrible towards Indigenous Australians. But to presuppose that unless you adopt the exact methodology of the Prime Minister in relation to the voice, that you are morally inferior simply for asking questions, I think it's completely wrong. I don't think the mainstream Australian community is going to accept that approach, and I think that Mr Dutton is absolutely right to be asking the questions that he's asking.
I think it's not an issue of having a heart, it's an issue of having a ticker. And I think the Australian public and First Nations people in this country are being disrespected the longer the Liberal Party hold out on declaring their hand on the voice. It's one thing for Peter Dutton to come out and apologise for not being there for the national apology because he recognised that he was on the wrong side of history at that time. What is he going to say the day after the referendum when the Australian public overwhelmingly support First Nations people wanting to have a voice in Parliament?
Where do you sit, David? Do you support the voice or not?
Look, I support the position that we've adopted as a shadow cabinet, which is to
But others in your party, Andrew Bragg has supported it, Julian Leeser has supported it, others have come out and said that they support it.
Like many of us in our party, I want to hear more answers from the government, and I think we'll go through that process. I don't think that it should be a case that this must be resolved tomorrow. I think it is more important.
Well, it's not being resolved tomorrow. The date hasn't been set for the referendum. It's going to be months and months away. The campaigns haven't even started yet.
Sure. It's a rhetorical. I just mean quickly. I think that what should happen is that there should be a sensible, well-informed, orderly discussion. I think that Mr Albanese should address each of the questions that Mr Dutton has asked, and people can then form their view. And I just don't. I find it very odd that the argument is that Mr Dutton should not be asking questions.
The questions are a diversionary tactic.
No, they're not.
To stall for time.
No, they're not.
Until Peter Dutton can see that it's a popular thing in Australia.
Sorry.
He is playing politics with the voice to Parliament. He's playing politics with the voice to Parliament. It is an in-principle question that's being posed to the people, which will then be determined, the detail will be determined by parliamentarians in legislation that will follow this in-principle support of a voice to Parliament. What Peter Dutton is doing is stalling for time to see whether it is popular amongst the people. We know that it's popular amongst Australians. He needs to stand for something and be on the right side of history, and so he can be judged accordingly. It's like some people in politics are enjoying the drama of it. You know, they want the politics of it. It is like watching a very bad heteronormative rom-com where there is the tension. You know, there's one side saying this is good for us, the other side saying, but I don't know you very well. And then, but the thing is that the Liberal Party started this. Noel Pearson said this today, and the Liberal Party started this. The Howard government started this. The Malcolm Fraser government started this. In the late 70s, some of us remember the road to Makarrata even then. This is not something that the Liberal Party should not be taking ownership of. The Liberal Party started this. Finish what you started.
Just really quickly, David, just really quickly, because we do have a final question to finish on. Would you support a conscience vote when it came to it, rather than being bound to any party?
We'll work through that in shadow cabinet of the party room, and I'm not going to preempt that process.
Thank you so much for your question. We're going to finish tonight discussion with a question from Richard Grummett. Richard?
Stan, my question's a simple one. It's initially directed towards you, actually. Why do we only or mainly speak English in Australia? Why aren't we all taught to speak our local Indigenous language too?
Thank you very much. Narelda?
I begin and end my bulletins with Kaya, which is my Nyungar language for hello, and Burda, which is we'll see you again soon. You know, and I think it's just a really beautiful way. Children are learning that on Nyungar country, where I come from. Children learn that. Children come home and tell their, hear me say that on the bulletin and tell their family. She's saying hello, because children are learning that at schools, but it's a school by school basis, isn't it? It's not a curriculum thing. It's the goodwill of the school.
I think, look,
I know that we've got politics here, and I'm not from that, and I certainly don't know anything about it. I think I come from a bit of a different space where I'm naive, but I just want everyone to get along. And I'm, you know, I was a refugee twice. I know what things like this can cause. And we've seen wars over the years. We've got a massive one still on at the moment where tens of millions of people are refugees. I think ultimately everyone needs to get around, I think, just a different mindset in society. Why can't we get along, respect other cultures and other people? You know, I'm trying to learn some words. Waminjika, is that correct? Did I say that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
From this language of this country.
Absolutely.
Welcome.
So, and I come from a different culture. I was not born in Australia. I came here when I was 11. I think you learn, and I try to respect other cultures as well. I think in general, this is what we need to have as a society. If we don't, it leads to wars. It leads to us being divided in this world. And we're in 2023. We shouldn't be having these discussions about that.
Indeed. Thank you so much for your question. That's all we have time for. Thank you again to our panel, Jelena Dokic, Michelle Rowland, David Coleman, Imogen Senior and Narelda Jacobs. And thank you for sharing your stories and questions as well. Next week, I'll be with you live from Sydney. Joining me, Ukrainian Ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Miрошhenko, also US Senator Sarah McBride, and Professor at ANU's National Security College, George Brandis. You can head to our website to register to be in the audience for that. It's going to be a timely discussion, of course, looking at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine 1 year on, and we've learned tonight US President Joe Biden has made a surprise visit to Kiev as well. So in my language, Marang Niang, that means good night, and Mandangur. Thank you.